And we're back again on Fresh FM, the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen. We're doing the election special. We've just covered the national. Basically, they're not going to become the government. So, of course, the other scenario is that Labour becomes a government which governs alone by itself. Very looking unlikely because of the polls out there. All the ones pretty much will say that she hasn't quite got enough to make it there, or she's going to need a lucky break. Of course, at the moment, there's a lot of things going on at the moment. You've got people like out there like Billy Bullshitter and Jamie Lee Ross of the Advance Party all running around saying Jacinda's a dirty communist, and of course that equally that corporate party that's actually quite sort of pro Jacinda and more part of that whole cult of personality, which is, again, just, I'm not picking on Jacinda, it's what we've seen happen in New Zealand, the personification of America. John, we got it with John Key as well. It's all about let's keep the focus on the leader of the political party, and pretty much you can even go back to Muldoon that did this, and in that way we don't actually get to spend too much time looking at the actual cabinet and realising that they're all actually not quite what the front person makes out them to be. So there's a lot of perception out there that sort of tries out to make it, oh no, Jacinda's a communist. That actually really works very well in regards to what Jacinda's marketing people want. They want to market her as left wing. They want to market her as being liberal, and they want to hide the fact that, of course, that she was previously the spin doctor under Tony Blair, which was in the 2000s, and Tony Blair was the poster boy for the UK version of Rogernomics. So that's that whole idea where Labour turned right. Jacinda was very much the core part of that. She was involved in working for Sir William Sargent in the Bureau of Better Business, where they were helping big businesses get into public partnership with governments, where effectively big business effectively took over state assets and privatised assets. We're seeing that actually happen here in New Zealand. Unfortunately, if people weren't paying so much attention to COVID, they'd see the state sector reform bill, they'd see the water regulation bill, they'd see the forestry privatisation, they would see the beginning of water privatisation, they would see a whole bunch of things being, money being spent, which puts us in greater debt, which then puts us more, behoves us to these World Bank and IMF, which are run, effectively funded and financed by corporations. So having Billy Bullshitter go out and turn around and discuss, say, Jacinda as pretty communist actually works really well for Jacinda's party. When you compare the two, it's actually quite interesting. You look at what those two parties don't talk about, and that's where it gets really interesting, because all those things I mentioned beforehand, TPPA, forestry privatisation, water privatisation, state sector reform bills, these are things that Billy Bullshitter doesn't talk about, and neither does Helen Clark, and neither does the mainstream media. So that's actually what's, by turning around having this thing about conspiracy theorists and making out that anybody that critiques the government as a alt-right wing, supremacist, is actually distracting from the fact of her left-wing critics who say no, she's not. Because you've got to realise that if you go and look on Jacinda and you look at things like the Worldwide Socialist Web, the actual socialists out there give her they give her an F report. They think she's a very bad socialist. They very much tie in with that whole neoliberalism. But people go, but she was a member of the ISO, the International Social Organization, president of the Youth Arm of the United States. Yeah, no, because again, if you actually do your research, you find that the ISO has been collapsed. It's been largely collapsed because it's been proven to be a tool for basically American imperialism. Takes a lot of groups affiliated take money from the National Endowment for Democracy, who've used it effectively to carry out regime change and to make attacks against China. So all these, terrible Marxists, we're socialists, we think this too. So very much like Martin Bradbury going, oh no, Rocket Lab's terrible, but we've got to have those P-38s to keep us protected from those evil commie Russians. Real shades of echoes of the Cold War, and this is interesting when you turn around and start to look again, all these things going on. We've got B-52s being invited over here, symbols of dropping nuclear bombs being invited to good old nuclear-free New Zealand under this Jacinda Ardern, Winston Peters government. We've got Ron Marks talking about the Pacific reset, which is where about 6% of the US Navy want to come down here anyway, take over all the resources in the Pacific for a dream of US imperialism. Cindy's not saying anything against that. We've got $20 billion being spent on defence, which happened admittedly under National, but was signed off in Labour. They spent more money on defence this year as well. So then, of course, you've got things like Rocket Lab, and you start to realise when you start to look at more and more, and we're doing shows on past and presents, that more and more what gets launched from that, it is actually $1.78 billion. The biggest shareholder is Lockheed Martin, and it's Lockheed Martin that's helping run the operations in Antarctica, which are expanding onto New Zealand territory, and it's Lockheed Martin that's running the drive for deep sea mining in the Pacific and what we call the Zealander continent. Huge, that's a sort of a recent area of geology on the Earth which actually extends New Zealand's economic exclusion zones massively. Americans are very keen to kind of get that in their sphere of influence. And, this is what we're seeing as the growth of Five Eyes. It's now extending out into economic regions, extending out into the Space Joint Command, which New Zealand's very much part of, and Labour's been very, very, very silent on this. Of course, you've got Helen Clark Foundation. They're working very closely with the AUT, which is New Zealand, with the Auckland University of Technology on the space program there. And when you start to look into that, you find US military dollars all over the place, but nobody wants to talk about that. So what I'm basically saying is that, Jacinda is not as liberal as we all like to make out, and Billy Bullshitter really helps us steer that in that direction away from that fact that she's not actually quite as liberal as we like to make out. So they're in some ways peas of a pod. So yeah, so that's very interesting because you're going to get into the next election, and you're going to find that basically that Labor needs to form a coalition. And at the moment, what it basically boils down to is it's either going to be Greens or New Zealand First. When you look at the numbers, they only need one party to get into coalition, but it's going to be one or the other. And everyone immediately assumes that, just like they assumed that Labor was going to vote against the TPA because they told us that's what they were going to do, and then they didn't, just like Winston Peters did for the TPA and 1080, because he's not very good at keeping his word either. They assume that it's going to be Labour and the Greens, because Labour's all about saving the planet and all these liberal things. But we have yet to see what will actually turn out. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is this polling at the moment turns around, and Labour, Greens were nearly on the way out, but then they look like they're actually basically climbing back up between 8 and 11%. So what we can expect is to see a lot more in the documents suddenly appear, and there'll be an attempt to basically embarrass the Greens, because Winston Peters really needs to get the Greens out of the way if he's going to be that coalition party. At the moment, of course, everyone's writing Winston Peters off. I think that's a terrible, terrible mistake. I think that if you actually look at the fact that he has brought in people like the bad boys of Brexit, I think it's Alan Gilmore, but that's how he's best known as the bad boys of Brexit, who use all sorts of social media and cyberware and analytics to basically divide and conquer, so that they could actually, they worked on a strategy where they weren't trying to win votes, but they were trying to make the other guy lose votes. And that's what Winston and Peters is actually employing. And by using parties like Billy Bullshitter and the Advance Party, that really actually helps drag votes away from National Act, and hopefully basically what he doesn't get, he takes away from them, so he kind of closes the gap by default. I think that's especially going to run in true in places like Te Takaroa, where you're looking at seats that can actually be won. The difference can be between 300 to 3,000, like the very small votes. So all they're going to do is they don't just have to win votes, lose the votes. People like Jamie Lee Ross and Billy really serve that situation. And I think that's what we're going to see. I also think we are going to see, as predicted by the amazing John Key, who has a real crystal ball. He's just so onto the episode of this, and so did John Podesta. They all are like, oh yeah, you're going to get cyber hacked, and it's going to come from the Russians. Just interesting, as I'm talking, this is September the 6th, suddenly we're getting attacked by Russians, and the stock exchange, and TSB Bank, and Rupeo, and a whole bunch of other areas. And what I've actually done a bit of research too was I found out that last year, 2019, there was a little competition to basically vote for pigeons. Yes, you hear me right. And there seemed to be basically a bit of dodginess, because about 300 votes came from Russia. But everyone, well, they've used all the right codes, and. But I actually think I'm very curious about one, because I think that might have been a bit of a test run, and I think even some of this stuff that's happening on exchange at the moment is a bit of a warning shot. And I think that yes, we are going to possibly see replication of stuff like you've seen with the Trump situation, where these so-called Russian hackers, and the thing is, everyone assumes that by Russian it must be Vladimir Putin, but it's not that black and white. We don't have time to go into that, so maybe I will do a full cyber hacking show, and I think I probably will. But yes, I think we're going to see some faults occur to voting come from online as well. So it won't just bullying the bullshit out there using tricks. We're going to see, just as we saw predicts, that there will be a cyber component actually take place there as well. Of course, we're also interested that Winston does have that interesting Russian connection. He's got guys like Ross Morant working for him, who ties to Russian banks like Prop Bank and so on. So I think this could be very, very, very curious. More importantly, I think really is interesting situation is this quick move where You're now allowed to do online voting, which of course means that all your overseas voters are going to be using it. People at home, especially younger ones, are going to go out there and they're going to vote. Now, if those votes get disrupted, which is what the DDoS cyber attacks are specifically focusing on, those votes don't get in the ballot. Suddenly, the votes that maybe the Greens thought they were going to get don't occur. Suddenly, that's another way that votes can be taken away. So, I remember saying to you before, Winston Peters is running a strategy at the moment where he's not just trying to get votes, he's trying to cost the other guys votes, and that's what the whole Protect Bad Boys were really actually about. I think it's really interesting that this has actually taken place at the time when, remember Kim Hill interviewed a guy called Wayne Marston on the phone and on Radio New Zealand, and this was back a while ago, but when George Bush was running, and it was proven, it wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was proven that online voting cost would have been Al Gore massive amounts of votes because of online hacking from computers, and that issue has never been resolved. We're now going into COVID because it's like, oh, COVID-19, oh, we might need to do this because people don't want to stand in line and so on. But at the same time, despite 2 or 3 years and companies like John Key's now working for Palo Alto, John Podesta saying, well, no, New Zealand's are very vulnerable. Even though we're vulnerable, we're now deciding to go ahead and do something that we know that we're vulnerable at, which seems to me a very strange kind of decision, and I'll just leave it at that. I think on that one is I'll pick the song that I'll go with. That one will be Computer Games. Now that was Computer Games was MySex. They did that in the Control Data Centre, which is where they recorded that, Control Data Centre in Australia. That company was based also in New Zealand. If you read my book State Secrets, which is on my website, I've got it as a free PDF, you'll see I talked all about CDC, which was the very origins, beginnings of cyber warfare and IT dodgy CIA connections. Had the offices in Wellington and both the buildings opposite or inside National Labour Headquarters. So that's all the way back in the 1980s. Such stuff we were already talking about it. It even came up with things like David Longy saying no to IT programs that were going to be brought into New Zealand because he knew that they were linked to dodgy US connections that would allow Trojan horses in. So we've had lots of warnings. So why we're so vulnerable, I don't know. Well, I guess that's a rhetorical question. But yes, we have MySex Computer Games. Your Ben Vidgen Fresh FM, the Deadline Report.